3.
Okay, so this is how we plan in on-level 7th grade math. So this is our unit planner, and we actually go through by day. We are currently planning Unit 4. Unit 4 is constant rate of change and proportionality. So in day 1, on this column of our unit planner, we've got the learning target for the day. In the middle column here, the success criteria that will help students achieve that learning target. And then in our third column, these are all the parts of our lesson that we would be using to support this and be able to assess.
So you would say that on the third column, it is based off the success criteria, where you are analyzing the actual objective of the lesson?
Yes.
Okay.
So they're all the parts of our lesson that help our students achieve success for each success criteria. And they need all of the success criteria mastered to be able to say that they have achieved that learning target for the day.
Okay, and the language that you would use for the students to understand the lesson itself, are they student-centered, or are you using academic language that is more tailored toward adults?
So my attempt is always to use student-centered language that helps build to academic language that they're going to be seeing when they are reading, solving problems, being assessed.
Okay.
So it's not tailored towards adults, it's tailored towards what they need to be able to be successful. So we take words, language that they understand, and relate that to how they're going to see it in their practice and assessments.
Okay. Okay, and so it is broken down by TEKS.
Yes.
So the first day, you are talking about representing constant rates of change. It says mathematical and real-world problems given pictorial, tabular, verbal, numeric, graphical, and algebraic representations. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that particular TEK for me, please?
All right, so when we're representing constant rate of change, just like you mentioned with that TEK, the TEK is 7.4a, and the TEK is pretty broad. We are representing the constant rate of change several different ways in the TEK. So in the TEK, we would teach the students to look at the data in table form, tabular form, and be able to find the constant rate of change from a table. We would also teach the students to be able to interpret the data in a graphical form, so in an actual graph, and be able to find the constant rate of change from a graph. We would also be teaching the students to find the constant rate of change from an equation. And so if they were given an equation, they'd be able to identify the constant rate of change. And the fourth way that's written in this TEK 7.4a is to be able to find the constant rate of change when given a verbal situation. So let's say like a word problem or a paragraph that explains verbally what the situation is. So there are 4 different ways that students are needing to be able to interpret constant rate of change. Now in day 1, we can see the learning target here. And these always kind of start with I will learn, to have that student-centered language so they kind of understand like what's going on. I will learn to find the constant of proportionality, which is our constant rate of change when things are proportional. The constant rate of change can happen. They're kind of interchangeable depending on the situation, but we start with constant of proportionality because it leads them from their last unit, Unit 3, which was all proportionality, into rates that can vary sometimes or that may not be proportional.
Okay. I actually like how it is actually aligned to the prior subject beforehand, because
Yes.
it does scaffold the content. That's really good. And how will your end goal assessment measure the objective? So your actual DCA assessment, how does it relate back to the objective of the lesson?
So in our DCA, we have several questions that assess this TEAC in all the different parts of this TEAC. Like in this lesson, the learning target is just to be able to find the constant of proportionality from a table. So it is a pretty broad TEAC. We're finding it from a table, graph, equation, and situation. So we've broken that down into different days, but for example, in this day, we're focused on tables. And then the next day, we take tables and create graphs from the tables. So initially, we thought about just focusing on graphs the second day, but like you said, we try to help students bring their prior knowledge, previous knowledge, carry it forward. And so we're in our day 2, we're actually gonna start with a table, since they should be comfortable by day 1 with tables, and then plot the graphs from there so that they understand the connection between graphs and tables. And then in day 3, when we plot our graphs, we're actually going to use the table, plot the graph, and then write the equation from the graph. So each day they're adding, right? They're not just forgetting tables after day 1 or forgetting graphs after day 2. Each day we are always starting from tables, creating a graph, then we'll generate an equation. On day 4, we'll start from tables, create a graph, generate an equation, and then see if we can write a situation from that.
Okay, so you are using the graphs, but per day, so you still scaffolding the content. So,
Yes.
Okay. And you said at the very end you were using.
The DCA is our, the District Common Assessment DCA is our final assessment for the unit. However, we do have formative assessments throughout. So if you take a look at, like, on the teacher end of this, teacher column of this unit planner here, so I have here a do now. Do nows, what I try to do with the do now is I try to do like spiraling of different topics that we've covered in 7th grade, and some are supporting topics that they need from previous grades that are usually directly helpful in this lesson. So in this do now, it's focused on rational number operation practice. That's just fractions and decimals, adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. Well, that's something they've already learned in previous grades, but they're going to need that in order to be able to find the constant of proportionality.
Okay, so you were using your warm-ups. And those are assessed, they were assessed prior.
Right.
And so how do you assess the warm-ups as you go along? Because I know is this your way of making sure they understand the content as we go along?
So it's kind of twofold, right? We want to make sure that, like when we're spiraling, we're wanting to make sure that they're getting practice with that they're still being able to perform these operations correctly, accurately and correctly. And we also want to make sure that they understand that we're bringing prior knowledge and now adding it to what we're learning. So in this unit, in order to find the constant of proportionality, students are going to look at the table and they're actually going to divide rational numbers. This is something they've already learned how to divide rational numbers, but they're using that to be able to find constant of proportionality. So I start with a do now of just, here's something you already know how to do. Let's practice it. Let's assess and make sure that this is fresh. And then let's deal with any misconceptions or any sort of, holes in their knowledge. Sometimes you get new students, sometimes students forget things. And so that handles that in the beginning of the lesson. This is a previous TEAC from a previous unit or grade that you're going to need to use in this lesson to be successful.
Okay.
So we start with that. And it's a do now. So as soon as they walk in, they're handed that and they immediately get started. With do nows, we do have think, pair, share. So they are allowed to they work on it first by themselves, think about it, work on it, and then we will pair them up, usually with their shoulder partner. Sometimes we do randomization, depending on, with this lesson, I didn't have a plan for randomization, but there are times with our do nows where I will have preset partners that they've already, like if you're using your winter partner, or find someone with the same birth month and think pair share with that. So sometimes just to add some movement or to get students working with different people.
Okay. I want to ask about your exit ticket. How does it match the actual rigor of your DCA assessment?
So the exit ticket actually pretty well matches the rigor of the DCA assessment most days. There are some days where it takes us a few learning targets to get to a DCA question. There's some DCA questions that do take maybe 1 or 2 days, or even 3 days to match that rigor. But with this one, for example, the exit ticket does match the rigor of the question that is given on the DCA, where they would be given a table, and they would have to be able to find the constant of proportionality from that table.
Okay. So do you use any sort of manipulatives within your exit ticket, or is that within the actual lesson itself?
We use the manipulatives more within the lesson.
Okay.
So if you take a look at this particular lesson, the success criteria are broken down, basically all the different things a student would need along the way to be able to reach that learning target. So we start off with, I can read and understand a table. And so the first part of our lesson focuses on that, and then we actually have a mini formative of where students self-assess. Like, do I feel like I feel comfortable reading and understanding a table, interpreting a table? And then once the majority of us have that, we would move on into our second part of the second success criteria. I can determine the relationship between the numbers of the table. So in your table, you're going to have your inputs and your outputs. And so first, we want to understand, do you understand what the inputs are, your independent variable, right? Do you understand the outputs, which are your dependent variables? Then our second success criteria would be to understand the relationship between the input and output. What happened to our input to create our output? And then we want to be able to define that relationship and call it the constant of proportionality.
So, okay, so you are defining the actual, I wouldn't want to say key terminology, but the actual process itself,
Yes.
right? So you're defining the process within proportionality, right?
Yes.
So it's not just the key terms, okay. Okay, so the last question I have for you, how will you model the lessons for the students to be successful?
Model the lesson?
So, for example, for social studies, if we are using some sort of reading passage, and the reading passage has to do with the Alamo, I will first model the annotation before they actually work on the reading itself.
Oh,
So-
okay. Right, so in that case, when we actually go through our lesson, and we actually use Nearpod, we model it a couple of different ways. So I have different types of learners in my classrooms. I have some learners that are audio, some that are more visual, some that are more kinesthetic, some that are like different styles of learners. So we try to have different ways to model it. Like in this particular lesson, after the do now, we have guided practice, and in that guided practice it starts with a video, which is helpful for some of our learners who it's interactive so they can kind of see what's happening. It has music for our learners who learn much better when things are put to music, right? And so that one, and then they can kind of be passive learners and where they can see, hear, and experience it. After that, then I actually go into visuals, where I'm using a physical table, and we actually talk about, as a class, we have a group discussion. And so that's gonna catch more of our audio learners. and some of our visual learners. Then we also have um, manipulatives where we're actually creating tables. So we're trying to be able to help every type of learner in the room be able to understand, read and understand the table, and then interpret the relationship between our inputs and outputs.
I also like your use of your word walls, using vocabulary around the room to actually have students really understand what you would find within word problems themselves. I like how you do that as well.
Yeah, I am still working on my word walls. As I'm trying to help out, especially my English language learners, I'm finding that one thing I happen to be lacking. I use color and I used a lot of the vocabulary with explanations, but what I don't have enough are visual representations. And so if you are learning the language, a visual is really, really helpful. So that's what I'd like to add to my word wall, is more visuals to help. And even maybe cognates, the overwhelming majority of my English language learners are actually Spanish speaking. And so there are a lot of cognates in math that can be helpful.
Well, thank you for your time and the data that you provided me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.